Okay, guys, this is another lecture on Newman, and this one has to do with his argument for God. As we'll see, it's not strictly speaking a proof, as Newman understands the word proof, but it is a very significant argument by which we can become convinced with a real apprehension of God and a real assent to the proposition that he exists. So without further ado, I will screen share and we will get off to the races. So this little lecture here, Reason, Conscience, and the Way to Real Assent in the Knowledge of God. Let's see, okay. So does Newman offer a proof for God's existence? The pages that we'll be dealing with in Grammar of Assent are among the last ones in part one, where he offers a kind of proof, although he says it's not really a proof, although it leads to a proof. So what is he doing here? Well, he says it's not a proof, at least as he understands the word proof. And he understands the word proof as something like a demonstration, a deductive argument, something that proceeds by way of an inference, something like a syllogism. And so he says explicitly, I'm not considering the question that there is a God, but rather what God is. So his argument is not trying to prove to you that there is a God. His argument is about discovering, well, what is God? What are we talking about? What's the meaning? What do we apprehend when we say the word God? What is God? And nevertheless, the argument, I'll wait for the bell, our lovely bell. And nevertheless, the argument is at least the beginnings of a kind of proof. And here's what he says. He says, it is true that the same elementary facts which create an object for the assent also furnish matter for an inference. And in showing what we believe, I shall unavoidably be in a measure showing why we believe. So the distinctions that are being drawn here are the following. His argument is about elucidating an object for an assent to that God is, or a real apprehension of God. And in showing the object for such an assent, and showing the real apprehension behind the word God, we are creating matter for an inference. And in as much as we're creating the conditions for an inference, and therefore a demonstration or some kind of proof in the proper sense, then we are showing, then we are offering here a kind of proof. But his strict intention is not to concern himself with the role the apprehension might play in a proof, but to focus on the apprehension itself. What is our apprehension of God? What is it like? What does that word God mean? What is the meaning of that word? He's looking, in other words, for a real assent to God. How can we make a real assent to God? Can I attain, he asks, to any more vivid assent to the being of a God than that which is given merely to notions of the intellect? Can I enter with a personal knowledge into the circle of truths which make up that great thought? Can I rise to what I have called an imaginative apprehension of it, namely of God? Can I believe as if I saw? Hopefully the next slide will elucidate this distinction even further. Oh, darn it, I went too fast. Now you see the wonderful surprise. There we go. Okay. So so hopefully this next slide elucidates a little bit the distinction drawn in the last one. Where can I put myself so I'm not in the way of this? So anyway, Real Assent and Religious Questions is the title of this slide. So Newman doesn't want to rest with merely a notional knowledge of God. He says we can have that by following, the Porphyrin trees, where we compare different things and rise from, the concrete things in our existence to higher forms, and with Plato get all the way to the form of the good. I can know God notionally in this way. I can rise up to him with the concepts in my mind that emerge by my comparison with different things. I can say, oh, that's a good apple, and that's a good man. And I say, oh, they have something in common. And I recognize an abstraction that, can be predicated of both of them. Good. And when I do such things, I get to the top of my ontology with being or good or something like that from a Platonist. And Newman says, okay, yeah, I can identify that with God, but is it possible to get a more real apprehension, or am I only allowed to know God with notions? So we could distinguish, for example, between the God of the philosophers in a different sense of the word philosopher than Newman usually uses in a Grammar of Assent. When he speaks of a philosopher, he means of the experimentalist, or the somebody who does have a real apprehension. So when I use that expression here and the notional apprehension of the God of the philosophers, I'm using it in a different sense, which also appears in the tradition. The sense, namely, contrasted to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of history, the God who, is really involved in your life. And here we've got Abraham there. So you would say that he knew God in a pretty real way. God was engaged with his life, and he apprehended God in the concrete particulars of his daily existence pretty intensely. And it was not just like a theoretical, speculative, abstract idea of God that you might have if you just follow some kind of philosophical argument notionally understood about the form of the good or the form of being or something like that. Here's a quote from Newman that will again help elucidate this difference. So when the proposition is apprehended for the purposes of proof, analysis, comparison, and the like intellectual exercises, it is used as the expression of a notion, so the proposition that God exists. When for the purposes of devotion, it is the image of a reality. Theology, properly and directly, deals with notional apprehension, religion with imaginative. However, Newman would say that theology, in as much as it's a science, in as much as it deals with notions and concepts that can be employed in formal logic and everything, in that sense, it's a science and it's dealing with notions. However, a genuine theology, a theology that is descriptive of reality, is going to have carried within the meaning of its terms also a real apprehension. So the good theologian is not the one who just plays with concepts about God. The word God for him certainly can be employed in a discursive conceptual discourse, but it's always going to have a real meaning to it as well. It's going to be a theology that's rooted in religion. This is, I think, another way of saying the famous quote of Balthasar, that what we need today is a theology on its knees, a theology that knows how to pray. So a theology that's rooted in a devotional life, and not as an arbitrary act of piety, but precisely in order to be a theologian, and in order to understand the meaning of the terms under discussion, you need to have that real apprehension of them. Okay, so how do we get to this real apprehension? How do we go from more than a notion? Well, Newman begins by asking, well, how do we get to know real things in general? What we experience in the physical world is really just a flux of phenomena. Our knowledge of a concrete unit underlying all the phenomena, he says, is the result of a kind of instinct. Strictly speaking, you don't see, with your physical eye, the squirrel running across the tree. You see at best like brown, green, light, shape, flash. You see the brilliant, ever-changing kaleidoscope playing upon our retina, as Newman says. The apprehension of a substance, of a unit, of a concrete reality underlying all those phenomena, he says, belongs to a kind of instinct that we have, that we see something that gathers into a unity underlying all of the different phenomena. So why do we perceive unities in the kaleidoscope of sense experience? Not by sense, for this apprehension of a unity transcends sense. The one that underlies the many colors, that one is not something you see by your physical sense. It's also not something that we apprehend by reason, at least not particularly human reason, because animals too are able to recognize other squirrels and stuff like that. So by what instinct do we make sense of the brilliant, ever-changing kaleidoscope playing upon our retina, even in physical experience? So what happens for us in physical experience, Newman contends, can also happen in intellectual experience. we do have a kind of spiritual eye. There is a world of spiritual phenomena or intellectual phenomena, geistlich, as a German would say, like where it's spiritual, but not in the sense necessarily of like, religious spiritual. It's spiritual in the sense of not physical, but still very real, in as much as your own thoughts are real, your rationality, your will is real. And Newman would say also your life of conscience is real. And so spiritual in that sense, not physical, but still real, and not necessarily religious, although it certainly is open to such an interpretation. So anyways, what do we see with our spiritual eyes? Newman says that now certainly the thought of God, as theists entertain it, is not gained by an instinctive association of his presence with any sensible phenomena, that is, any physical sensible phenomena, like you would gain the presence of a squirrel by recognizing and by that instinct that there is a concrete unity underlying the multiplicity of phenomena that you do sense. But the office which the senses directly fulfill as regards creation, physical creation, that devolves indirectly on certain of our mental phenomena as regards the creator. Those phenomena are found in the sense of moral obligation. So it's in the experience of moral obligation or the life of conscience, a mental phenomena that Newman is going to contend we apprehend a concrete unity that we call God, that underlies the multiplicity of the phenomena and gives it coherence, just like the rushing and bustling brownness, that we see running about a tree can be gathered into a unity by our apprehension of the squirrel. So, in other words, we have a kaleidoscope of conscience. We have a lot of phenomena going on in our interior life that can be gathered into a unity in a way that Newman is about to show us. Now, first, he does a little phenomenology of conscience. So, what is the phenomena like? What is it that we experience in our interior lives? You should read the pages for yourself. There's a lot of rich stuff there. But to boil it down to the basics, he says that the feeling of conscience is something that includes two aspects. The first is it includes a moral sense. That is, we make a judgment about what's right and wrong. We have to discriminate. This is a good thing to do. That's a bad thing to do. But that's not the only thing that goes on in our conscience. We also, in this feeling, have a sense of duty. That is, once we, shake out what's right and wrong, we don't say, oh, that's right, that's wrong. Okay, that's quite interesting. It's like, no, you have this duty. You got to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. We feel a magisterial dictate. That recognition of what's right doesn't come to us with a sort of neutral value. There is something that says, do it. And it's a voice, Newman says, because it's something we experience as a dictate that transcends us. It's not like, you might say, oh, I should eat broccoli because I want to, be healthy or something. You don't experience it as something you give to yourself. You experience it as something you hear from another. So therefore, it's something that you feel beholden to, a sense of duty. In this sense, it's heard as a voice beyond the self. And thus, we have an emotional sense of our responsibility. When in our conscience, we experience reverence, hope, fear. You wouldn't fear yourself if you were just obeying, a law you gave to yourself. The reason we feel fear when we do something wrong, the reason we feel guilt when we do something wrong, is because we recognize that this thing we did wrong was the disobedient rejection of a dictate that came outside of me. And oh my gosh, what's that dude going to do to me? If I break my own rule, I don't have to be afraid because I could just, say, oh, I broke my own rule. Oops, But if I broke someone else's rule, I now am afraid. Or more positively, if I, do something right, then I feel a certain sense of lightness and elation and warmth before the world because there's a sense of affirmation coming from outside of me. So anyway, this phenomenology of conscience is something, again, you can read in greater detail in Newman and think about in your own experience. Is there a difference between the the regret I have over the fact that I got sick, like, oh shucks, I wish I didn't get sick. And the regret I have when I do something sinful. It's like, it's not just like, oh shucks, I wish I didn't get sick. It's like, oh gosh, like, why did I do that? I shouldn't have done that, but I did it. The experience is very different. So anyway, you can reflect on that yourself and see with Newman what else belongs to the phenomenology of conscience. And how do we make sense of this kaleidoscope? Well, Newman says that if we feel responsibility, are ashamed, are frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience, this implies that there is one to whom we are responsible, before whom we are ashamed, whose claims upon us we fear. These feelings in us are such as require for their exciting cause an intelligent being. We are not affectionate towards a stone, nor do we feel shame before a horse or a dog. We have no remorse or compunction on breaking mere human law. Yet so it is. Conscience excites all these painful emotions: confusion, foreboding, self-condemnation. And on the other hand, it sheds upon us a deep peace, a sense of security, a resignation, and a hope, which there is no sensible, no earthly object to elicit. How are we to explain this apprehension of things which are one and individual in the midst of a world of pluralities and transmutations, whether in the instances of brutes or again of children? But until we account for the knowledge which an infant has of his mother or his nurse, what reason have we to take exception at the doctrine, as strange and difficult, that in the dictate of conscience, without previous experience or analogical reasoning, he is able gradually to perceive the voice or the echoes of the voice of a master, living, personal, and sovereign? So here, Newman combines the two kinds of experience that we've been talking about the physical phenomena and the spiritual phenomena in the one human being of the child. And he says, yeah, it's quite marvelous that the child recognizes a single unit, a mother, behind, under all the phenomena of his physical experience. And is it any less wondrous that the child on its own will come to apprehend this transcendent, loving, benevolent sovereign underlying or behind all the spiritual phenomena that make up its interior life and its life of conscience? There is something remarkable that children instinctively come to apprehend the reality of God. And it's usually not until, they awaken in less edifying ways that they begin to put into question that original apprehension. There's something very remarkable about the pure development of the religious assent to God that happens in a child. It's for other reasons that we begin to go back and kind of dismiss that pure, simple experience where, if you ask a 5, 6, 7-year-old, it's usually pretty clear to them that there is a one behind all things. And they may not be the most articulate philosophers, but they understand what you mean when you tell them God loves you, God wants you to do X, God wants to be friends with you. They get it. They know whom you're talking about. And they know whom you're talking about because they experience their own inner life. They trust its coherence. And so they come to this kind of real apprehension of God. Here's a slide that is sort of a philosophical primer if you're having trouble with the argument thus far. I'll go through it relatively briefly because I want not to make my videos too long. But basically, to recap this philosophical point about the unities of experience, you could say, what are the unities of our experience? So a true unity would be an authentic grasp of a physical substance. A false unity, and there can be false unities that we think we apprehend. Newman gives one of the illusion of the inviolability of the laws of nature. That page reference is wrong, by the way. That's from a different edition that I just realized now I didn't correct. Or you could consider, for example, the difference between the true unity of a plant and the false unity of something like a mousetrap or a machine or a computer. Ask yourselves, the unity that underlies this mousetrap here, that's from the game Mousetrap, is really just something that the architect of that mousetrap projects onto it. In itself, it doesn't hold that unity. It's just a heap of plastic parts. And the only reason for which you and I would call it a singular noun, like a trap, and speak about it with a singular pronoun, it, and therefore ascribe to it a particular unity, is because that sequence of parts happens to achieve an effect that we anticipate and that we predict and desire. We have some end set for it. So on its own, however, it doesn't have any unity. You could take away half those parts and it could still be your mousetrap if it achieved the effect. Whereas the plant is not like that. Whether you or I notice it or not, have plans for it or not, it is a one. And its parts cannot be taken apart and then reassembled as the mousetraps can, according to our own dictates. There's something there to be recognized rather than projected. So a physical substance, like a living thing, is an example of a ontological unity or something that really is out there in being. And then similarly, we've got, according to Newman's argument, the reality of God as a real substance. And these two are opposed. On the one hand, the living thing, like the plant, is opposed to a computer, which is just a projected unity, because it is in reality just a heap of parts arranged together by whom? By me, according to a particular design that I have in my head and project onto those parts in order for it to achieve a particular end. Just like a bunch of dominoes, I put all those circuit boards together and then click play, and electrons click, 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 and produce a pixel. So too with a computer. That's contrasted with the living thing like a plant. And then also in our spiritual experience, you've got the reality of God, a real substance that we recognize. Or you've got something like the white noise of our spiritual experience. You could say, if you wanted to deny God, that, oh no, God's just a projected unity. The only thing that's really there is just a heap of voices inside our heads. It's really not a coherent, actual unity. When you say God, you are just like saying computer on a bunch of parts. You are projecting onto something that is inherently not unified, not ordered, a false unity. And Newman would say probably that, oh gosh, that's a very dark view to take of one's own interior life. And one could also say, I think, that that ultimately leaves reason in a very precarious position. So it's hard to make that argument rationally. If conscience is involved in distinguishing the true from the false, the good from the bad, and now you're telling me that whole experience is incoherent, it's all just white noise, then I think the person even making that argument has to begin to wonder whether they take seriously what they're saying. As long as they're pretending to make a rational argument to you, they have to have some credence in the reality of their own reason, and therefore see a real unity to it that Newman would want to call God. So what do you think? Is the interior life only white noise, or is it a coherent and unified dialogue between one unity, you, and another, God? Or is each interior life just an incoherent, irrational byproduct or epiphenomenon? What do your eyes see? Here's a fun little slide. I don't know if you ever did these when you were a kid. Magic eye. I could still do it. It's obviously much easier when it's like a real poster. But if you give yourself a second, see if you know how to do these things, and whether you see should I tell you what it is? It's a dinosaur. It's a dinosaur right in the middle. And the idea behind this slide is that, what is your intellectual life like? Is it just a kaleidoscope, or here an apparently random assortment of pixels? Or do you have the eyes that can see the unity underlying this apparently incoherent white noise of spiritual experience? I can see the dinosaur. Hopefully you can. If not, Google magic eye and see what you're missing. Okay. A fun little aspect of this is the idea that we can strengthen this real apprehension of God. And Newman says that we can strengthen it by essentially following our conscience. So Newman recognizes that we can know God notionally. You can say, oh, yeah, that's right, that's wrong. There is a true and there is a good. And you can, therefore, on the basis of recognizing this is true, this is false, this is good, this is bad, you can abstract just like Plato and get a kind of form. But that's just a notion. How can we, see this as a reality? And again, it has to do with the experience of conscience. And Newman says that the more you encounter goodness, that abstraction, in real particular things and choose it, the more your apprehension of that goodness that makes coherent the experience of good things is going to be associated and close to your own real apprehension of the good particular. And the more you will therefore change into a real apprehension what at the beginning might just be notional. So let me read his quote and then I'll try to explain it once again. So from such experience, we proceed to abstract and generalize. And thus the abstract proposition, there is a right and a wrong, as representing an act of inference, is received by the mind with a notional, not a real assent. So first, when you are with Plato talking about this is beautiful, this is not beautiful, this is good, this is not good, this is true, this is not, you are contrasting things and therefore rising up to a generalization like truth and goodness and so forth. That's first just a notion. However, Newman says, in proportion as we obey the particular, real, concrete dictates, which are its tokens, so are we led on more and more to view it in the association of those particulars, which are real, and virtually to change our notion of it into the image of that objective fact, which in each particular case it undeniably is. So if you want to strengthen your real apprehension of goodness, choose again and again and again good things. If you want to weaken your real apprehension of goodness, waffle. Show yourself that you really don't recognize, very strongly anyway, good and bad. When we make a choice, we are affirming the goodness of something. We're saying that is desirable and therefore I will it. That has a very powerful effect on our capacity to apprehend reality. It's our lives are not inconsequential for our eyes, spiritually speaking. So the more sensitive we want to become to the reality of truth, goodness, beauty, the more we have to choose true, good, beautiful things. If we are constantly hesitating, our grip on them will become weaker. And I imagine that makes sense. I hope it does, and I think it's a philosophically for me it's a very satisfying explanation for why the moral life is so important for good philosophy and theology, and for why saints are not just like holy people in the sense of being a do-gooder, but it's like, no, those people, they see God in a way that you and I don't. Insofar as we're not saints, it's blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God, Jesus says, one of the Beatitudes. So there is something about the coherence of our moral life and your capacity to apprehend God as real as anything else you know. So always let your conscience be your guide, like Jiminy Cricket says. Okay, this is a small little objection that I sometimes hear when I talk about conscience, or probably most of us here, if we just go out in the blogosphere and see what people say. Some people think that conscience is just, you got a daddy complex or something where, you just can't shake off that guilt of trying to please the old man or something, or it's just society, social conditioning, just forcing you to, conform to its arbitrary dictates and so forth. Well, I just want to compare Newman's idea of conscience with the caricature and show you just how different it is. So the modern caricature of conscience is what I call multiple voices mobbing. So this kind of picture over here, which really does look awful. Newman's idea of conscience is not multiple voices mobbing. It's not people, yelling at you from all different directions. It's a single voice And it's not just standing there to accuse and point a finger, but to guide. Is that this is good, this is bad, for your own good, to do the good thing. So it's not somebody pointing a finger at you. It's somebody pointing a finger at like the good thing. Go over there. The character thinks of the phenomenology of conscience as, just the faceless, impersonal, crowd, again, the mob. Whereas Newman thinks of conscience ultimately as a phenomenology that's rooted in the metaphysical reality of a person, of somebody who is in a relationship with you. You don't have a relationship with a mob, but you can have a relationship with a person. The caricature of conscience insists that all its dictates are just about conforming to arbitrary constructs. Newman says, no, the conscience is, I experience it at least, phenomenologically, the dictates of conscience are always about an authentic goodness. It's not just about, I say jump, you say how high. It's about, no, actually leading you to fulfillment and happiness. So I think of conscience much more like this happy little lady here down by the horizon, opening out to truth and beauty and goodness. Okay, no, that's it. All right, so I hope you had a great time. Thanks for stopping in, and good luck reading Newman and learning a whole bunch of wonderful things. I will stop the recording now. Ciao.